Hello and welcome back to Society Case Files. My name is Robert, and today I wanted to talk about the TV show Dune Prophecy. This is a little bit controversial for me because I'm a huge fan of Dune. I've read every single book, all of the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson books, all of Frank Herbert's books, and Dune itself is the only book I've read more than 5 times. I've read a lot of books a few times, but none more than 5, except for this. And I've always just loved it. In fact, my parents pretty much convinced me to try it as a teenager, and I just went from there. Saw the David Lynch Dune when I was 10, and then read the book, found out just how crazy different it was, and from there I just had a love affair with this series and the world and everything about it. And I really loved all the characters. I love the intrigue. I like the different factions very much. And it's funny that I find myself now at this point very much into Warhammer 40K, considering how much Dune inspired it. I mean, there's so many little things here and there, and actually some pretty hefty ones too. But Dune Prophecy, coming on the heels of the 2 movies, which I could make a whole video about talking about those too, but I had a feeling that I knew what I was going to get. Thanks to those 2 films and how they glossed over so many rather important elements of the setting and the characters and what was going on, I didn't think we were going to get a much more in-depth version of those things in the TV show. And I was absolutely right. So, for example, the Spacing Guild in the movies has been fairly relegated to a dramatically minor role. I mean, we do hear how much it costs, but as far as their influence over society as the monopolistic transport company, it just kind of got ignored in a lot of ways. We don't even get an explanation for mentats. We do see a very strange eye fish thing go on with one of them, but you don't really have a really good explanation for what they're all about. So with Dune Prophecy, it suggests that it is taken from the book Sisterhood of Dune. It actually starts a little bit sooner than that, and then it jumps around and does some flashbacks. But for the most part, it does its own thing. I think it would have been more fair to say it was suggested by the books that Brian and Kevin wrote, because they really did go pretty far afield with their ideas. Here and there, they take snippets of the novels. They'll take a name and they'll throw it out there, but they're almost afraid to show this character. And it started off really annoying, but I adjusted my thinking and my expectations, and I found the show to be a lot more enjoyable. And this goes for anything that is an adaptation, for that matter. So as I think about things like The Mayfair Witches or Interview with the Vampire, Dune Prophecy, any of that kind of stuff, if you think of them as fan fiction, it's a lot easier to stomach, because honestly, all adaptations are kind of fan fiction. Yeah, sure, they've been paid for it, and they are supposedly professionals, and they're supposedly really good at what they do, because otherwise, how could they possibly have gotten this job? But at the end of the day, unless the author writes the screenplay, then it is fan fiction. Now, occasionally the authors don't do the best job with their own screenplays, but, be that as it may, you could be mad at them at that point, but it's hard to really fault people who get the opportunity to make their own thing with whatever IP they end up with, and then they do that. They make it their own. And in a way, I kind of see that. One of the things that I've complained about in the past with adaptations is that what's going to happen. So it feels almost hard to watch, because you're like, and then this guy's going to die. Oh, he died. And then this is going to happen. And you know that because you've read all these books. So it's kind of a catch-22, because on one hand, you kind of want to be surprised. I mean, maybe you've read the book a couple times. Maybe you've read all these books and you've got all this in your head, and you have a very specific vision for the way it should look. And then it happens and you go, oh, Okay, I've seen it, and yeah, that's cool. And maybe you do just want a visual representation of what you've seen. I just struggle with that myself because my imagination's pretty darn good, and I could come up with a very elaborate world in my head when I'm reading a book. So it's harder for me to be super critical when they change things because I'd like to be surprised if I'm watching something. Now that said, the surprise for me needs to at least be rooted in the foundation of what makes the product unique. So like, take for example the book Blood and Chocolate. It was written by a librarian, I believe, for a high school. And it's a young adult novel. It takes place in America. It's about werewolves. But the movie bought the rights, moved it to Romania, and just went ham. To the point where the author was like, I'm not entirely sure why I got a lot of money. I'm grateful, but I'm not sure why they paid me for that. They could have just put another name on it. It would have been fine. It's nothing like my book. And it was. It was nothing like the book. Aside from a few names and some tentative relationships, they could have done anything. And they would have saved themselves some money. And so sometimes you really have to wonder, well, what was the point of that? Now, it's slightly more offensive when they get really close, but they miss some of the points. Like, for example, Dune Prophecy. By eliminating the Spacing Guild from the action and turning them into a glorified version of Uber that can just show up and get people from point A to point B instantaneously, no waiting for a highliner, they just seem to be there no matter what, so they can hop back and forth between planets. It overly simplifies their role in the universe. The miniseries has a great moment where Paul is getting a lesson from a hologram version of Thufir Hawat that says that the Imperium is based on a political tripod, that being the Emperor, the Landsraad, and the Spacing Guild with their unbreakable monopoly on space transport. So because they have the capacity to literally end trade anytime they want, to just cut a planet off, to the point that Paul's warned, do not try to look at one of those navigators or we will lose our Spacing Guild privileges. They have tremendous power. Even in the David Lynch version, a navigator shows up and orders the Emperor to kill Paul Atreides. So cutting them out completely just seemed like a really strange idea. Relegating it down to space witches and an empire situation where there's like a massive ruler who does whatever he wants for the most part and then finds out he's a puppet. We could have seen this in other things. Now, I haven't personally watched Game of Thrones, but what I know of Game of Thrones, I think that it probably does a better job than Dune Prophecy did, at least at the beginning, of generating this political turmoil and showing some pretty brutal stuff. The Witcher has a group of witches and magic users that are basically capable of turning the tide of the kingdom too. So it's really hard for Dune to stand out as unique when we take away several of the unique features of the setting. I mean, the Spacing Guild, during the books that they supposedly take from, is establishing the navigators as we know them in the future. The spice-gassed, freaky mutant guys that are capable of the prescience to get them from point A to point B without blowing up a highliner, for example. And at the same time, the Mentats are doing practically the same thing that the sisters are in this movie, or this show. Because in this show, we've got the sisters doing their breeding program. Well, the Mentats are over here trying to keep a low profile as well, because they've just come out of the war too. Cutting those two factions out completely, let's just be honest, they're gone. And they do mention Mentats, but I don't even think we saw one. I did finish the whole season. But I don't know. All around, I have to admit that Dune Prophecy left me fairly cold. There were some grand moments. Some moments that made me legitimately cheer, and I thought they were awesome. But there was so much glossing over and so many little montage moments that I felt like, maybe you guys should have done 8 episodes so that you could have filled in some of those gaps, so that we could have explored more of the past, so we could have cared more about these characters for when they had their struggles later on. We would be like, yeah, that makes sense. As it stands, there's several acolytes that I think should matter a lot, and they should have a fairly large impact on the story, but I couldn't tell you their names. I know their faces, for the most part, but I don't know what they're called. And other than a couple of the main characters, which happen to share names from the books, I don't really feel like the story does the best job at including you in the characters' plights. I will say this, it is HBO, and they don't completely go over the top with the titillation of hardcore sexy scenes. There's only a couple. But there are plenty of moments here and there where it's like, this could just be gone, and we could have had more of this, which would have established additional plot and made things a lot more interesting. But I don't know. I mean, I will probably watch Dune Season 2 because I seem to have a repulsion-compulsion disorder when it comes to these shows and the new movies. I really did not enjoy the new movies as much as I could because, again, they did the same thing. They cut out key components of the setting. I wouldn't have minded if they would have gone pretty far afield had they included all the elements and then worked them in a different way. Cutting them out completely was kind of a waste of an opportunity. They needed longer. They needed more time for both the movies and this show. I think that the movies that we got should have been a long-ass series. Like, the first season should have been the first movie. So instead of however long it is, 2 hours and some minutes, it should have been a 6-hour part. And then season 2 should have been the second half of that book. And then season 3 could have been Dune Messiah. That way we would have gotten enough time to really establish all of the things this setting had to offer. Way back in 1984, I think it was, when the David Lynch version came out, people would go to the theater, and at some select theaters, they would receive a pamphlet that helped them understand all the things there was to know about the Dune setting. Just like a lexicon of terminology so that they didn't go in there and go, what? What is all this? What is this nonsense? What are they even talking about? Is this even English? And if you think about that movie is not short. It's 2.5 hours long. And then there's a ridiculous director's cut that adds a whole bunch of scenes in that David Lynch hated. But if you think about that, if you think about the fact that way back then they were like, here's this pamphlet to learn about all this stuff. Then the miniseries came out that did a much better job of capturing the whole show, but of course it was a shoestring budget, so it looks like the play version of Dune, which I'm not knocking. I absolutely love that version. That's my definitive version. And then you get the new movies where they're like, well, instead of giving out a pamphlet and instead of taking a whole lot of time, let's just cut a bunch of the fat and really only focus on Paul. Now, part of the problem with that is that if just focusing on Paul means that you're going to not really understand some of the things that he has to labor under when he's thinking about his next move. There's certain things he just can't do because it would offend this group or that group. And coming all the way back to Dune Prophecy, because I'm rambling a little bit here, it suffers from the exact same thing. They needed more time. They needed to establish their characters better. They needed to not eliminate complete factions within the Imperium. And they needed to focus a little bit more on the big picture. Allow some of these characters besides the Harkonnen leader of the Sisterhood to have a grand plan that we actually are seeing. Now, there are villains that seem to, but those that were the most dangerous didn't prove to be as scary as we thought. Now, again, I'm really trying to avoid any big spoilers. The show just ended recently, and I just finished watching it. And I know that people are so busy, they may not have watched all the episodes yet. But I think that if you go into it thinking it's fan fiction and just accepting the fact that they've really made it their own and that they've taken a step back from the setting itself and created something new, it's sort of Dune Light or Dune names applied to a new-ish story. I think you'll have a lot more fun with it. Of course, if you're not at all a Dune fan and you've never read the books and you're still just interested in the show, it is absolutely beautiful, and the actors do a great job. So all around, I think that you could have a great time with it at that point. It's a little harder when you've invested as much time as I have reading all those books to let a few things go. I'm doing my best. I'm hoping in a few days I'll absorb it even more, and maybe I'll even find a little bit more to like about it and sort of give them a pass. But for now, I'm going to say that Dune Prophecy is not the best experience if you're a huge fan of the books, but an overall triumph of cinematography and acting. It's a masterclass in acting for some of the people who are in it. They're just incredible. I loved them. And even though I'm being very critical now, I was very emotional at several points of the story. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Dune Prophecy. Have you watched the show? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Are you a big fan of the Dune books? Have you read them all? Let me know in the comments below. And this is Robert from Society Case Files signing off.